Before the first bell rang and before the hum of teenage chatter filled the corridors, the heart of Brookstone High School was already beating. It beat in the slow, steady footsteps of Evelyn Moore as she pushed her cleaning cart down the main hallway, the wheels creaking softly over the tiled floor. The morning light, golden and gentle, filtered through the tall windows, casting quiet beams across her path. Her shift always began before sunrise, not because she had to, but because she wanted to be there before the world stirred, to prepare the school not just physically, but spiritually for the day ahead. Evelyn was 64 years old, though most wouldn't guess it at first glance. Her movements were slower these days, her knees reminding her of time's passing, but there was an undeniable grace to the way she carried herself. She wore her hair in a neat silver bun, her uniform always clean, pressed, and dignified. There was a sense of quiet pride in her posture, the kind that didn't ask to be seen but somehow always was. She didn't need accolades. She didn't seek attention. She simply showed up every single day and loved the place into order. Brookstone High was a public school tucked in the heart of a working-class town. Its bricks were weathered, its ceiling tiles occasionally stained from past winters, and its paint chipped in the corners where backpacks brushed daily. But to the students, it was home. It was a place of ambition, of second chances, and of ordinary heroes. And perhaps the most extraordinary of them all was Evelyn Moore, who had been cleaning those same halls for nearly 4 decades. The students didn't call her Ms. Moore. She was simply Ms. Evelyn. That name echoed through the halls with warmth and familiarity. For many, she was the first smile they saw in the morning and the last gentle voice they heard before leaving. She remembered birthdays, handed out granola bars from her own purse to students who skipped breakfast, and tucked handwritten notes of encouragement into lockers of kids she knew were struggling. She wasn't paid to do these things. No one assigned her the role of counselor, cheerleader, or protector. But she'd given herself those roles a long time ago. It was her own way of shaping the future, not through lectures or grades, but through presence and love. She didn't have children of her own at Brookstone, but over the years she had hundreds, thousands maybe. One of them was Marcus Gray, who had walked the halls as a shy 10th grader grappling with the loss of his mother. Evelyn had found him crying in the stairwell. She sat beside him for nearly an hour that day, saying almost nothing. When he finally looked up, she gave him a tissue and said, "You don't have to be strong all the time to be strong." Years later, he sent her a graduation photo from medical school with a note that read, "I still carry your words in my coat pocket." These stories weren't rare. Evelyn had touched so many lives that her influence became almost mythological. Students who had long graduated would return to visit, not their former teachers or coaches, but her. They'd sit beside her as she wiped down the cafeteria tables, sharing stories of college, jobs, or marriages. Evelyn listened, smiled, and reminded them, as she always did, that their journey still mattered. Despite her impact, Evelyn never once acted like she belonged on a pedestal. She clocked in with the same humility every day. Her name wasn't on any wall. She didn't have an office. Her locker was tucked behind the boiler room, adorned with a photo of her granddaughter Layla, who had just been accepted to Howard University. "My star," Evelyn would whisper, looking at the picture with pride that radiated from her chest. Layla had grown up watching her grandmother live with purpose. She had inherited not just her ambition, but her resilience. Evelyn often said that the school talked to her, not in words, but in feelings, the energy in the hallway, the mood in the classrooms. She could tell when a student was having a bad day just by the way their footsteps echoed down the corridor. She knew which locker doors slammed harder when kids were anxious and which water fountain kids lingered near when they were trying to avoid class. She noticed everything because she paid attention, not just with her eyes, but with her heart. That's why, on one particular Monday morning, When the tone in the school felt just slightly off, Evelyn felt it deep in her bones. Something had shifted. It was subtle, a strange tension in the air. Conversations whispered instead of shared. New posters were being taped up in the main office. A meeting had been called for staff during the lunch hour. The faculty room door was closed more tightly than usual. Brookstone High had always weathered change. New administrators, new policies, new testing systems. But this change felt different. It wasn't procedural. It was personal. Evelyn didn't ask questions. She observed. She noticed when a few teachers left the lunch meeting looking confused, while others looked worried. She noted the new name written on the class schedule pinned near the main entrance. Mr. Derek Shaw, History, Room 207. There was something sharp about the lettering, as if the name itself carried edges, but Evelyn didn't jump to conclusions. She never had. She believed in letting people reveal themselves, and in her experience, they always did. That morning, as she cleaned the floors outside room 207, a group of students passed by and greeted her with waves. "Morning, Ms. Evelyn." She smiled, offered each of them a soft nod, and continued scrubbing a scuff mark from the tile. Then, the classroom door opened. A man stepped out, well-dressed, tall, and calculated in his movements. His gaze swept the hallway, like he was taking inventory of everything around him. Evelyn paused just briefly and met his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but clipped. "This area's been wet for a while. You planning to finish any time soon?" Evelyn blinked, absorbing his words like a splash of cold water. "Yes, sir. Just finishing up." He glanced down at the mop in her hand. "Make sure it's dry before the bell rings. I'd hate for one of my students to slip." There was no smile, no warmth, just an assertion of control. He didn't ask her name. He didn't thank her. He walked back into the room without another word. Evelyn stood still for a moment. It wasn't the rudeness that struck her. She had endured far worse. It was the look in his eyes. A look that said, "I don't see you." She returned to her work, letting the silence wash over her like armor. But something in her chest stirred. A memory, perhaps, or a warning. Change had come to Brookstone, and while Evelyn had seen many come and go, she sensed that this one would test more than patience. Later that afternoon, a student named Tasha ran up to her in the hallway, breathless. "Ms. Evelyn, I got an A on my science project. You were right, I could do it." Evelyn smiled, as if the morning's bitterness had never touched her. "Of course you could, baby. You just needed to see it for yourself." They exchanged a quick hug before Tasha ran off to class. Evelyn turned back to her cart and continued down the hallway, past lockers, past echoes of laughter and frustration, past memories she had lived 1,000 times. This was her home. These were her kids. And no new name on a classroom door was going to change that. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew who she was. Evelyn Moore, the woman with no title but all the authority where it counted most, in the hearts of those who truly knew what leadership looked like. Not loud, not flashy, but steady, present, unshakably kind. She pushed her cart toward the gymnasium, humming a quiet tune under her breath. The soul of Brookstone High was alive and well, and it was still moving forward one quiet step at a time. The second week of September carried with it the whisper of seasonal change, cooler mornings, sharper winds, and a sky that began to turn that unmistakable gray of autumn. For most students at Brookstone High, the rhythm of the new school year had already settled into something familiar. Hallways buzzed with chatter, classrooms were full again, and football tryouts had taken over the athletic field. But beneath the surface of routine, something unfamiliar was beginning to form. A shift, a murmur. It began with the simple announcement of a new staff member, Mr. Derek Shaw, History Department. The memo was brief, formal, but in a school like Brookstone, where relationships mattered more than resumes, a new face in the faculty lounge often came with quiet curiosity. Principal Monroe introduced him during a Monday morning staff meeting. Derek entered the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had long rehearsed his introductions. Tall, with carefully combed hair and an expensive charcoal suit that seemed too formal for the setting, he offered a well-rehearsed smile and a firm handshake to each department head. "It's a pleasure to be here," he said, his voice smooth, his words efficient. "I'm looking forward to raising the bar." The statement landed awkwardly in the room. A few teachers exchanged side glances. Ms. Tran blinked slowly. Mr. Lopez raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Evelyn, who had come in to refill the coffee pots and quietly arrange chairs, simply observed. She noticed how Derek never once looked her way, not even when she stepped aside to let him pass. It wasn't unusual, but it was telling. Brookstone High had its share of new hires over the years. Some blended in, some stood out, some left quietly. But from the moment Derek Shaw stepped into room 207, he wasn't trying to blend in. He was performing, and he was watching. His first week was filled with subtle posturing, sharp critiques of the curriculum in department meetings, long monologues during classes that often veered into personal opinion disguised as historical insight, and an uncanny ability to dominate every conversation he entered. He corrected colleagues mid-sentence. He questioned long-standing school policies with an air of condescension masked as curiosity. His tone was never overtly hostile, but it had teeth. To students, he was a curiosity at first. He spoke eloquently, with well-pronounced syllables and an old-world charm that some found refreshing. He demanded formality. Mr. Shaw was to be said with precision, and students were expected to stand when speaking in class. He lectured about power structures and history with passion, but his examples often made students shift uncomfortably in their seats. He praised leadership in ancient Rome while subtly criticizing modern civil rights movements. He asked leading questions that steered conversations in unsettling directions. "Why do you think some cultures have remained less developed for so long?" he asked during a world history class. "Do you think equality is truly attainable, or is it just an ideal we use to feel moral?" He posed to a group of juniors. Some students laughed awkwardly. Others stayed silent. A few brave ones pushed back. Poor B. Jalen Carter, always eager to speak his mind, challenged one of Derek's interpretations of post-war segregation. Derek smiled thinly and replied, "That's an emotional argument, Mr. Carter. Try grounding your views in evidence next time." Jalen didn't speak up for the rest of the class. Within days, Evelyn began to hear whispers in the halls. "He's weird," one student said to a friend. "He talks like we're all beneath him." Another mentioned how he rolled his eyes when someone mispronounced a name. And then there was Maya, a sophomore who rushed past Evelyn one afternoon, face pale. When Evelyn gently asked if she was okay, Maya shrugged and said, "He made me read out loud in front of everyone, and laughed when I stumbled." Still, Derek had his defenders. He charmed the district curriculum coordinator during a surprise visit. He sent detailed lesson plans to Principal Monroe, complete with annotated reading guides and powerfully worded objectives. He offered to lead a modern history through Western philosophy seminar for staff, insisting that Brookstone needed a more rigorous intellectual standard. To many on the outside, Derek Shaw looked like a gift: educated, polished, ambitious. But Evelyn saw more. She saw how the students' eyes dimmed after his class, how teachers avoided the lounge when he was there, how the tone of staff meetings began to shift from collaborative to competitive. She watched the subtleties: who he interrupted, who he ignored, who he mocked when no one was looking. She remembered the first time he addressed her directly. It was a Friday morning. Evelyn had just finished cleaning the staff bathroom near the teacher's lounge when Derek walked by, holding a cup of coffee. He looked down at the "Caution Wet Floor" sign, then at Evelyn. "Do you have to do this during school hours?" he asked, gesturing to the mop. Evelyn straightened. "Yes, sir. This is my scheduled time." He gave a half smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Interesting. Seems disruptive, but I suppose routines die hard. Then he walked off. She didn't reply. She just turned back to her cart, but her fingers tightened on the handle. Over the weekend, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, thinking. She thought of the students, the ones who wouldn't speak up because they were taught to endure. She thought of Layla, her granddaughter, who had once asked, "Grandma, what do you do when someone makes you feel small?" And she remembered her own answer. You remind them you were never small to begin with. By the time Monday came, Evelyn had decided she wouldn't just watch, she would pay attention, she would listen, she would make sure no child felt invisible under Derek Shaw's watch. She wouldn't confront, not yet. That wasn't her way. But she would remember, and she would wait. As autumn crept further in, the school prepared for its fall parent-teacher conferences. Hallways filled with student art, bulletin boards changed themes, and families began scheduling appointments. Derek decorated his classroom with framed quotes: Churchill, Thucydides, Ayn Rand. Miss Tran helped students paint pumpkins in her art room. Mr. Lopez organized a Voices of Brookstone poetry night. Evelyn decorated the entrance with garlands made from recycled paper leaves, each one containing a handwritten message of encouragement from students. Be proud of who you are. You are enough. History is made by the brave. She saw Jalen pause in front of them on his way to class. He traced one leaf with his finger. Then he looked back at her. "Thank you," he said softly. Evelyn nodded. "Anytime." And though she couldn't predict what Derek Shaw might do next, she knew one thing for sure. Brookstone's soul was still intact, and she would do everything in her power to protect it. The crisp air of October wrapped Brookstone High in its quiet grip. The trees on campus had begun their transition, green fading into deep reds and bright oranges, and the mornings came with breathy fog that lingered in the parking lot. Inside the school, the scent of pencil shavings, damp jackets, and cafeteria coffee mingled in the halls. It should have been a beautiful season, but for some students, a different kind of chill had settled in. Jalen Carter had always walked those hallways with a sense of quiet confidence. He wasn't loud, but he was known. He had a steady presence, a voice that carried not in volume, but in intention. His teachers admired his work ethic. His classmates respected his mind. He was the kind of student who asked the question no one else thought to ask, who volunteered for the thankless jobs, who stayed after school to help clean up even when it wasn't expected. Jalen loved learning, and he especially loved history, the patterns, the lessons, the power of perspective. It made sense of the world. But ever since Derek Shaw had become his history teacher, something had changed. The class that once excited him now filled him with a quiet dread. The space that once invited curiosity now felt suffocating, and the subject that once empowered him now felt weaponized against him. It hadn't happened all at once. At first, Derek's critiques seemed like intellectual challenges. "Let's push this further, Mr. Carter," he would say with a faint smirk. "You're almost there, but not quite." Jalen welcomed the push. He liked being challenged. But soon, it became clear that Derek's feedback wasn't about sharpening ideas. It was about dulling his confidence. When Jalen offered a well-researched interpretation of the Reconstruction era, Derek interrupted him midway. "Be careful not to let sentiment override scholarship," he said, eyes narrowing. "Try to keep your personal background out of it." The comment stung. Jalen had cited his sources, used evidence, constructed a thoughtful argument. But Derek dismissed it, not for its merit, but for what he assumed it represented. Another time, after Jalen offered a point about systemic barriers in education, Derek leaned against his desk, arms folded, and said, "That's a popular narrative these days, but I encourage all of you to think independently, not emotionally." Some of the students laughed quietly. Not because the comment was funny, but because it was uncomfortable. Jalen didn't laugh. He didn't even look up. He just stared at his notebook, his pen still in hand, frozen mid-thought. It wasn't just Jalen. Other students began to notice a pattern. Maya, a talented sophomore with a knack for analysis, stopped volunteering answers after Derek questioned her pronunciation of a historical term and said, "That's adorable. Let's work on enunciation." Sarah, a Korean American student, was once asked in front of the class how her heritage culture might view imperialism, an academic exercise, Derek claimed, but one that made Sarah feel like an exhibit. Evelyn Moore, meanwhile, kept watching. She noticed the way students exited room 207 more slowly than they entered. She saw how shoulders slumped and voices lowered, and she saw Jalen, once vibrant and bright-eyed, walking with his head down more often than not. One afternoon, Evelyn was wiping down the lunch tables when she noticed Jalen sitting alone near the back corner of the cafeteria. His tray was mostly untouched. His fingers tapped absently on the table, but his eyes were unfocused. She approached slowly and sat across from him. "Everything all right, baby?" Jalen hesitated, then offered a forced smile. "Yeah, Ms. Evelyn, just tired." Evelyn nodded, letting the silence linger. She knew better than to press. Instead, she pulled a folded napkin from her apron pocket and slid it across the table. "Sometimes when I can't sleep, I write down what I wish someone would say to me. Then I try to become that voice for someone else." Jalen looked at the napkin. On it, in Evelyn's familiar script, were the words, "You are not invisible, you are not too much, and you are not what they try to reduce you to." He stared at the words for a long moment. Then quietly, he said, "Mr. Shaw made me feel stupid today." Evelyn said nothing. She just listened. "He asked me a question about World War I, and I blanked. I knew the answer, I swear I did, but I froze. And when I said something about economic tension, he smirked and said, 'I'm not surprised. Stick to what you're good at, Mr. Carter. Sports, maybe?'" Jalen's voice broke. "I'm not even on the football team," he said, laughing bitterly. "And the worst part? No one said anything. Not even my friends. They just looked away." Evelyn reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "Sometimes silence is fear, not agreement, but that doesn't make it right." Jalen swallowed hard. "I've always believed I belonged in that classroom, but now I'm not sure anymore." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes steady and full of warmth. "You belong, not because you're perfect or because you know all the answers, but because your mind is strong, your heart is good, and your presence matters. Don't let one man's shadow dim your light." He nodded slowly, as if her words were finding their way through the fog. Later that week, Jalen began to pull away even further. He stopped attending debate club. He turned in a history assignment late for the first time in 2 years. He hesitated when called on in other classes. The damage Derek had done wasn't just academic, it was emotional, psychological. The sharpness of humiliation lingered far longer than a missed answer. Ms. Tran noticed too. She sent a message to the guidance counselor, Mr. Lopez. "Jalen's off," she wrote. "He used to be the first to speak. Now he avoids eye contact." Mr. Lopez scheduled a check-in. Jalen showed up, quiet and guarded. He said he was fine, but he wasn't, and Evelyn knew it. One afternoon, she found him behind the auditorium, staring at the trees shedding their leaves. He didn't hear her approach. "Some people think trees are dying in the fall," she said gently. "But really, they're just getting ready to grow again." Jalen turned to her, eyes red-rimmed. "It's hard to believe I'll grow out of this." Evelyn smiled. "That's the thing about growth. It doesn't ask your permission. It just happens, little by little, even when you think you've stopped moving." That night, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, pouring tea into a chipped ceramic mug. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her notebook and began writing. She didn't start with Derek's name. She started with Jalen's. She described a boy with promise, a student who had once glowed with purpose and now walked through halls like he was trying to disappear. She wrote about the damage caused not by outright violence but by words that sliced quietly, strategically, under the guise of rigor. She listed what she had seen, what she had heard, and what she would no longer ignore. Because for Evelyn, this wasn't just about one boy, it was about all of them. The children whose names she remembered, whose stories she carried like prayer beads, whose futures mattered too much to be left unguarded. Words could wound, but they could also heal. And Evelyn Moore was preparing to speak. Evelyn Moore had never believed herself to be a crusader. She was a woman of quiet revolutions, of gentle acts that, over time, changed the shape of hearts. But as the weight of Jalen's pain settled into her chest, and the echoes of Derek Shaw's words lingered like poison in the halls of Brookstone, something ancient and unmoving awakened in her. It wasn't rage. It wasn't vengeance. It was resolved, the kind that came not from impulse, but from decades of watching too many children made to feel small in places meant to grow them. That weekend, she sat at her kitchen table with the same notebook she'd used to track Layla's first words and her own grocery lists. Now it became something different, a witness. Evelyn began writing everything she had seen, heard, and felt since Derek Shaw's arrival. The moments others might have brushed aside, she documented with precision. The withering remarks, the way students avoided his class, the difference in Jalen's voice before and after room 207. It wasn't speculation, it was a pattern. And Evelyn knew that patterns, when named aloud, became evidence. But she also understood that words alone would not be enough, not in a system that so often failed to protect those without power. She needed something irrefutable. She reached for the small digital recorder Layla had gifted her the Christmas prior. It had been a practical gift, something Evelyn never thought she'd need. Now, it felt like armor. On Monday morning, she slid the device into the side pocket of her cleaning cart. Its red light blinked discreetly as she moved through the halls, sweeping and scrubbing as always. But now she was listening, truly listening. She positioned herself near open classroom doors, paused just long enough in faculty lounges, waited in empty hallways until voices carried to her. And Derek, so secure in his superiority, offered more than she had hoped. In one recording, his voice cut through the hum of a passing bell. Let's not pretend every student is meant for excellence. There's a reason why some rise and others remain. In another, I find it amusing how easily people confuse politeness with intelligence, especially those in less demanding professions. And in a third, captured just outside the break room. If we keep lowering standards to make everyone feel included, we'll have nothing left worth preserving. Each word burned, not because it was shocking, but because it wasn't. Evelyn had heard variations of these sentiments her entire life, in shops, on buses, between whispered breaths in meetings. But to hear it now, directed at the very children she loved, in the walls she had devoted her life to tending, it was intolerable. But she was not going to act alone. Evelyn knew that if this change was to last, it had to be built on more than one voice. So she began reaching out, carefully and intentionally. She approached Miss Tran first, finding her cleaning brushes in the art room after school. I need your help, Evelyn said simply. Ms. Tran paused mid-rinse, setting the brush down slowly. Is this about Mr. Shaw? Evelyn nodded. I'm gathering what I can, but the truth has more power when it comes from many. There was a pause. Then Miss Tran's shoulders lowered with relief. I thought I was the only one keeping notes. She wasn't. Within a week, Evelyn had quietly connected with Mr. Lopez, who had fielded several visits from distraught students but lacked the administrative authority to act decisively. If you build the case, he told her, I'll stand beside it. They formed what Evelyn called the circle. It wasn't formal. It didn't meet in offices. It was a whisper network of truth-tellers, teachers, aides, a few brave students, and even one parent who had overheard Derek's dismissal of her son's IEP accommodations as overindulgent coddling. The testimonies began to pour in. Evelyn gathered them by hand, by voice, by scribbling notes, scribbled and slipped into her cart when no one was looking. She built a file thick with statements and stories, matching the cold recordings with the living pain behind them. But something else began to happen too, something Evelyn had not expected. The students, seeing the silence begin to fracture, began to speak, not just in private, but in community. It started with Jalen, who asked Evelyn one day, "What if we created a wall where students could write about how they're feeling, anonymously or not, just somewhere to say the things they're scared to say out loud?" Evelyn lit up. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." The Wall of Voices was born in the corridor outside the library, a long stretch of unused corkboard that Evelyn quietly asked Principal Monroe for access to, presenting it as a student reflection project. He approved it without question. The first note was Jalen's. It read, "I thought I wasn't good enough, but maybe it was never me that was broken." The second was from Maya. "Words stay longer than bruises, but healing starts when we share." And then came dozens more, notes in every color and drawings, poems, fragments of pain and flickers of hope. The wall grew each day, a mural of resistance and resilience. Teachers began assigning optional prompts for students to contribute. Parents lingered longer at drop-off, reading in quiet awe. The wall became sacred. One morning, Evelyn arrived early to find someone had left flowers at its base. A sticky note attached simply said, "Thank you for listening." Even Principal Monroe, often distant in his administrative duties, took notice. He walked with Evelyn one afternoon, stopping in front of the wall. "What inspired this?" he asked. She looked at him, calm but steady. "Pain," she said, "and the refusal to let it stay hidden." He said nothing, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered on Jalen's note. Despite the growing momentum, Evelyn knew the real confrontation still lay ahead. Derek had grown more emboldened, perhaps sensing the shift, but unwilling to believe it could threaten him. His comments sharpened. His disregard for students grew more brazen, and still, no formal complaint had been filed. Evelyn understood the risk. She also understood the cost of silence. So she prepared. She sorted every recording by date and topic. She transcribed notes. She scanned letters. She compiled a binder thick with witness accounts and audio logs. And when the day finally came, a staff meeting called to address growing concerns around classroom climate, she walked into the room not as a custodian, but as a keeper of truth. She took her seat near the back, as always. But this time, her presence was electric. Around her sat Ms. Tran, Mr. Lopez, and two students who had asked to attend. They carried their own copies of testimony, their own courage. When the floor opened for discussion, Evelyn stood. She didn't speak with fury. She spoke with gravity, with clarity. She named what had been happening. She read excerpts from the testimonies. She played two recordings. And when she finished, the room was silent until Jalen rose. "My voice matters," he said, "and no teacher should make a student feel ashamed of it." His words cracked something open in the room, not just truth, but possibility. That night, Evelyn returned home, exhausted but certain. The fire had been lit, not for vengeance, but for every child who ever doubted their worth because someone too broken to see it tried to snuff it out. And Evelyn Moore, the woman of quiet revolutions, would carry that fire as far as it needed to go. Autumn deepened, and with it came the sense that Brookstone High was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. The air inside the school carried a tension more electric than the cooling winds outside. Teachers spoke in hushed tones between classes. Students avoided certain hallways. Some lingered longer than usual at the wall of voices, their fingers grazing the taped-up notes like they were reading scripture. And Evelyn Moore moved through the halls like a woman with a mission. Because she was. It had taken weeks to gather the evidence, weeks of listening, documenting, coordinating. But she had done it. The file she now carried in her bag wasn't just a stack of paper. It was a truth long ignored. It held the weight of dozens of testimonies, of hours of recordings, of statements written in the trembled hands of students too young to carry the kind of shame Derek Shaw had placed on them. She did not rush. She had waited too long to be reckless now. But when Principal Monroe announced a special faculty meeting to address internal concerns raised by multiple parties, Evelyn knew the time had come. She arrived early that morning. The sky was overcast, a dull gray, but her resolve burned bright. She placed the folder on her cart, then paused in front of the mirror near the staff restroom. She adjusted her collar, smoothed her hair, and looked herself in the eye. There was no fear left, just clarity. The meeting was held in the library, the largest space available that could accommodate faculty, staff, and the few board members who had been invited. Evelyn entered quietly and took a seat near the back. Jalen was already there, sitting beside Ms. Tran and Mr. Lopez. They looked up when she entered. She nodded once. That was enough. Derek Shaw walked in 5 minutes late. He wore his usual confidence like a finely tailored coat, exchanging smiles with a few of the board members he had charmed earlier in the semester. When he noticed Evelyn, his expression barely shifted, but his eyes lingered a second too long. Principal Monroe opened the meeting with a strained voice, reading from a prepared statement about the importance of a healthy learning environment for all students. He referenced recent concerns and the need for transparency. And then, surprising everyone, he handed the floor to Evelyn. She stood, slowly, her folder in one hand, her small recorder in the other. The room quieted instantly. "I've worked in this school for nearly 40 years," she began. "I've seen many things change. Teachers come and go, principals come and go. But what never changes is the way children look at you when they believe in you, and how they shrink when you break that trust." She opened the folder. "These are not rumor. These are not exaggerations. These are the words of students and staff who've watched a sickness grow in our halls, not because of ignorance, but because of ego, because someone believed his position gave him permission to humiliate, to demean, to divide." She clicked play on the recorder. Derek's voice filled the room. "Some people simply don't have the intellectual rigor for leadership. It's not their fault. It's just in their nature." Murmurs rippled across the room. Evelyn played another. "I sometimes wonder how this place would look if we stopped pretending that janitors and teachers are equals." Gasps. One teacher dropped her pen. Monroe's jaw tightened. Derek stood abruptly. "This is being taken out of context," he said, laughing lightly. "We're really going to let gossip dictate professional judgment now?" Evelyn turned to face him, calm and still. "These aren't gossip, Mr. Shaw. These are your words, recorded over weeks, matched with written accounts, corroborated by faculty, staff, and students." He looked at the board members, who now seemed far less confident in their earlier admiration. "This is absurd," he snapped. "This is a personal vendetta by a—" "Careful," Mr. Lopez said from his seat, voice low but cutting. Derek faltered. Then Jalen stood. "I was one of the students Mr. Shaw embarrassed. I've been in honors classes since I was a freshman. I've won state-level debate tournaments. But he made me feel like I didn't belong here, like everything I'd worked for was just a trick. He told me in front of the entire class that kids like me were only good for sports, and no one stopped him." His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. "I stopped raising my hand. I stopped speaking in other classes. I started believing him." There was a silence that settled in after Jalen's words, the kind that leaves no air in the room. Then Ms. Tran rose too. I witnessed the way he talked to students, especially students of color, students with disabilities, students who dared to have an opinion. He made us afraid to speak, but we're not afraid anymore. More teachers stood, one after another. Some spoke. Some only placed letters on the table. Even parents who had been invited as observers began to murmur, some in disbelief, some in sorrow. No one was defending Derek Shaw now. Derek tried to regain his footing. This is mob justice. You're ruining my career over feelings, over misinterpretations. You did that yourself, Monroe said, his voice colder than anyone had heard it. The board members conferred quietly. After 20 minutes of review, they announced that Derek Shaw would be placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation, effective immediately. But no one in the room doubted the outcome. He stood frozen for a moment. Then he gathered his things and left the room without another word. When the door closed behind him, it felt like a storm had passed, not just through the room, but through the years of silence that had allowed someone like him to thrive unchecked. Evelyn sat down slowly. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes remained dry. Jalen leaned over and whispered, "You did it." She shook her head. "We did it." In the days that followed, the shift at Brookstone was almost imperceptible but undeniable. Students walked taller. Teachers laughed a little more. The wall of voices became a place of not just pain but pride. The truth had spoken, and for the first time in a long time, it had been heard. The departure of Derek Shaw did not come with fanfare. There was no formal announcement, no assembly, no bulletin from the district office. One day, he was there, and the next, he was not. His classroom sat dark and empty for a while, the nameplate removed quietly during the weekend. But the absence of his presence was as loud as any fire alarm. In the days that followed, it was not just the space he left behind that people noticed. It was what had been exposed in the light. Brookstone High did not heal overnight. Wounds like the ones Derek had left behind didn't close with his exit. The students who had been silenced still carried that silence in their posture. The ones who had been mocked still heard echoes of laughter behind closed doors. But something had shifted, something vital. And that shift came not from forgetting, but from remembering together. The wall of voices, which had begun as a fragile tapestry of anonymous notes and whispered truths, transformed in those weeks into a monument of resilience. Students added to it daily, but now the messages read differently. There were still stories of pain, but they were now wrapped in strength. I found my voice here. We are more than what they said about us. Still here, still learning, still proud. One morning, Evelyn found a drawing tacked to the center of the wall. It was a sketch of a woman with a cleaning cart, surrounded by books, children, and rays of light beaming from her silhouette. At the bottom, in slanted handwriting, were the words, "Love is the legacy that never leaves." She stared at it for a long time, not because she needed the recognition, but because she understood what it meant. The students had found something in her that she had never sought to give as a gift. It was simply how she lived. But now it had become something enduring. Jalen began to change too. Slowly, carefully. He returned to debate club. He started staying after class again to help others. When asked to share a quote for the yearbook, he submitted a line he said was inspired by Evelyn. It read, "Speak, even if your voice shakes. It is not your silence that honors your story. It's your truth." Ms. Tran and Mr. Lopez, inspired by what had happened, started a new initiative called Brookstone Voices, a monthly student forum where students could safely share personal stories, speak on issues that mattered to them, and celebrate their identities. It was voluntary, but quickly grew in popularity. It created a new culture, one that was rooted not just in learning, but in listening. Evelyn remained steady in her work, but something in her pace softened. Her presence in the halls felt even more radiant now, as if students had finally been given permission to see her as she had always quietly been, the soul of the school. They brought her coffee in the mornings. Some stopped her just to talk. Others simply left folded notes in her cart. One note read, "I don't think I would have made it without knowing you were here." Another simply said, "Thank you for staying when others turned away." A few months later, Principal Monroe called Evelyn into his office. She assumed it was about a schedule change or a facilities matter. But when she sat down, she noticed something different in his expression, something reverent. "We've nominated you," he said quietly, "for the Brookstone Pillar Award. It's given to someone who has not only served, but transformed our community." Evelyn blinked. "That's for teachers." "No," Monroe said. "That's for leaders." She didn't cry. Not in that moment. But something loosened in her chest that day. Something she had held tightly for years. The quiet understanding that sometimes dignity was not recognized, only required. Now, it was both. The award ceremony was small, held in the auditorium. But every seat was full. Students past and present attended. Layla flew in from college and surprised her with a bouquet of yellow tulips, Evelyn's favorite. Jalen stood at the podium and spoke about what courage looked like when it wore a janitor's uniform and smiled through adversity. When Evelyn finally stepped to the microphone, the room fell still. She looked at the faces before her, young and old, proud and tearful, and took a breath. "I never saw myself as someone who would stand here," she began. "But I see now that sometimes you don't need a stage to lead. Sometimes all you need is to show up every day with love in your heart and the belief that every child matters, that no one is beneath your kindness and no one is beyond your protection." She paused, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on Jalen. "And when you fight for someone else's dignity, you are fighting for your own. That's what I've learned here." A standing ovation followed. Evelyn bowed her head and smiled, not for herself, but for what had finally been named. That spring, she announced her retirement. It was not a sudden decision, but a natural one. She had done what she came to do, and more. On her last day, she walked the halls slowly, soaking in the sounds, the memories, the echoes of laughter and tears. At the end of the corridor, she paused at the wall of voices, now framed and protected behind glass, preserved as a permanent part of Brookstone's story. Someone had added a final note that day. It read, "We carry your love with us. You were the lesson we'll never forget." She left the building as the sun began to dip, casting golden light through the school's front doors. She didn't look back, not because she was finished, but because what she left behind didn't live in bricks or titles. It lived in the students, in the teachers who had found their voice, in the walls that now bore the fingerprints of courage. Years later, Jalen Carter would return to Brookstone as a guest speaker. By then, he was a professor of political science, an author, and an advocate. He stood in front of the next generation and spoke of justice, identity, and power. But before he ended, he told them about a woman with a cart, a quiet smile, and an unshakable will to protect what mattered. "She didn't teach from a textbook," he said, "but she taught me more than anyone ever has. She taught me how to fight with grace, how to rise with love, and how to speak, even when it's hard." He paused and looked out at the students. "Her name was Evelyn Moore, and she changed my life." That night, when he returned home, he opened a drawer filled with keepsakes. Among them was a folded napkin Evelyn had once given him. The ink had faded, but the words remained. "You are not invisible. You are not too much. And you are not what they try to reduce you to." He read it again, just to remember, and then, carefully, he tucked it back in place. Because some legacies are not written in stone, they are carried in hearts, passed down like heirlooms of hope. And Evelyn Moore's legacy would never fade. Every story comes to an end, but some truths refuse to close with the final chapter. They echo forward, winding through time and memory, calling not just to be remembered, but to be lived. The story of Evelyn Moore is not just the journey of a woman who stood up in silence turned roar. It is the story of a school, a community, and a truth that was always waiting to be spoken aloud. It is, above all else, a reminder of what one soul, deeply rooted in love, can plant in the soil of 1,000 others. Evelyn never sought power. She never commanded a classroom, wore a blazer with a name badge, or held a seat in any board meeting. She swept hallways, cleaned spills, fixed jammed lockers. But through every quiet act, she wove a fabric of protection around the students and faculty of Brookstone, a tapestry that could only be fully seen when it was tested, and in its testing, held strong. We are often taught that power lies in status, in titles, degrees, in positions of authority. But Evelyn Moore taught us otherwise. Her strength was not in hierarchy, but in humanity. Her influence was not a product of what she demanded, but of what she gave, freely and without hesitation. And it is in her story that we are forced to confront the truth that dignity does not depend on recognition, and that real change almost always begins from below. Through the pain endured by students like Jalen Carter, we were shown how insidious prejudice can be, not always loud or blatant, but subtle, systemic, and suffocating. We witnessed how even the most promising of young minds can be dulled by the blade of contempt disguised as critique. And in Jalen's recovery, his courage to speak again, to stand tall, we saw that healing is possible. But it does not come from time alone. It comes from love, from witness, from someone believing in you before you can believe in yourself. This story reveals to us a hard but necessary lesson that silence, when faced with injustice, is not neutrality, it is complicity. The failure of others to speak when Derek Shaw demeaned and dehumanized students wasn't just unfortunate, it was a betrayal of the trust placed in them as educators, mentors, and adults. But through Evelyn, Ms. Tran, Mr. Lopez, and eventually Principal Monroe, we saw what happens when silence breaks. When one voice becomes many, when truth steps into the light, perhaps one of the most powerful lessons comes not from the confrontation itself, but from what followed. Removing Derek was not the end, it was the beginning, because accountability is only the first step. Restoration requires effort, listening, rebuilding, and most importantly, making room for the voices that had long been ignored. The wall of voices stands as a symbol of that change. It is more than paper and ink. It is the collective courage of students reclaiming their stories. It is a school finally seeing itself fully, flaws and all, and choosing not to look away. It is the evidence that healing is not passive, it is participatory. This story challenges us to look around our own lives. Who is being silenced in the rooms we inhabit? Who is doing invisible labor to hold things together without acknowledgement? Who among us suffers quietly while others look the other way? And perhaps more importantly, what role do we play in either perpetuating harm or interrupting it? It also teaches us that heroism is not a matter of spectacle. Evelyn Moore did not march into rooms demanding attention. She entered with a mop and a heart full of compassion. Her strength was slow burning, forged through consistency, humility, and the unshakable belief that every child mattered. She reminds us that to be a hero, one does not need power, only purpose, and then there is legacy. Too often, legacy is thought of as something grand, reserved for the few, the named, the celebrated. But the truth is that we all leave something behind. Every interaction, every moment of kindness or cruelty becomes part of someone else's story. Evelyn's legacy wasn't built in a day. but across decades of gentle hands and watchful eyes, and in the students who now walk with heads held high, in the teachers who now speak when once they stayed quiet, in the halls that no longer carry shame in silence, her legacy lives on. We also saw the impact of restorative leadership. Principal Monroe, who at first seemed distant and procedural, chose to listen when it mattered most. His decision to give Evelyn the floor, to trust her, to act on truth rather than comfort, that too is a lesson. Leadership is not about control, it is about courage. It is about amplifying the right voices, even if it means confronting difficult truths. Let us also consider the profound emotional truth at the heart of this story. That love, real love, the kind that shows up every day, that asks nothing in return, that sacrifices comfort for justice, is the most powerful force we possess. Evelyn gave it freely, and in doing so ignited it in others. Jalen passed it forward, Layla carried it into her own academic path. The teachers who once hesitated now model it in their classrooms. It is a ripple that became a wave. We live in a world that often overlooks the Evelyns, that praises the Derek Shaws of society, the confident, the credentialed, the charming. But Brookstone High chose differently. It chose to name its soul, to honor its keeper, to lift up what is so often left in the background. And so must we. As you close this chapter, I invite you to ask yourself, who are the Evelyns in your life? Who held you when you were falling? Who spoke the truth when it cost them everything? Who reminded you of your worth when you forgot it? And even more importantly, who can you be that for? Because the world doesn't need more people in power. It needs more people of purpose. If this story moved you, let it be more than a moment. Let it be a call. Speak when it's hard. Protect when it's risky. Love when it's inconvenient. And never underestimate the quiet fire of a heart that refuses to give up on people. We hope that Evelyn Moore's story stirred something deep within you, a sense of hope, of justice, of renewed belief in what truly matters. If so, we invite you to stand with us, share this message, carry it into your classrooms, your offices, your homes. And if you'd like to help us continue telling stories that matter, stories that inspire, challenge, and bring light to forgotten corners, please support us by subscribing to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep going, to uncover more voices like Evelyn's, and to ensure their stories are never silenced again. Click that subscribe button, share this with someone who needs it, and join our community of everyday heroes. Because when we come together with compassion, with courage, and with conviction, there's nothing we can't change. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.